Well, Lesotho's Prime Minister Moeketsi Majoro says it's critical for Lesotho to visit South Africa to maintain good neighbourly relations. He says some of the critical issues discussed with Ramaphosa include cross-border trade and health concerns.
It was therefore important and critical on our part to move quickly to pay a visit to the President Ramaphosa, to begin our work on improving our relations. You can appreciate the importance of this. It takes place within the context of a rampant COVID-19 in our areas, but it was important to do so at this point in time. We have discussed a number of areas, but more importantly, cooperation on COVID and COVID-related issues, including not just the medical, clinical side, but also the impact of the mitigation. We have critical issues across the borders. While we have official borders, our people don't always recognize those, and so they cross at any place that they want to cross. And this has a bearing on our ability to control infections in both sides. We needed to deal with that. There are many issues touching on trade between the two countries, movement of labor between the countries that need to be addressed. And I'm very happy that Mr. President has agreed that we deploy our ministers as quickly as possible to engage on these issues.
All right, for more analysis on this, I'm now joined by Siya Biniza, Executive Director at Political Economy, Southern Africa. Siya, good afternoon. Thank you very much for joining us. Ultimately, let's look at the timing of this meeting between the two states. Earlier on, Mr. Majoro cited, issues of trade as well as health concerns. But why is it important that Lesotho's Prime Minister comes to South Africa now?
Sure. Well, you might remember that he was sworn in last month after the resignation of former Prime Minister Tom Tabane, and so this is one of his first visits. And obviously, Lesotho having the closest ties with South Africa, geographic proximity, but also as members of the Southern African Customs Union, which is a quite significant contributor in terms of government revenue for Lesotho, but also trade amongst the countries, is of critical importance that Lesotho maintains its ties with South Africa. And then obviously, this is a mutually beneficial type of relationship, because South Africa, particularly Gauteng, relies quite heavily on water imports from Lesotho. And you might remember that over the past 2 years, there have been a number of hiccups with the implementation of phase 2 of the Lesotho Highland Water Project, which is really what cemented the relations between the countries from the 1980s up to where we are today. And the expectation is that the phase 2 will then expand on what's already been there and further cement the ties between Lesotho and South Africa. But I think, on the top of the agenda between President Ramaphosa and President Majoro is definitely how they're going to maintain stability in Lesotho moving forward, and also contain relationships as SACU members, whilst also being able to deal with some of the hiccups on the Lesotho Highlands Water Project or some of the cross-border challenges that they've been having.
Siya, looking, as you just unpack some of the economic dynamics between the two countries over the past few years, I actually want to delve into the responsibility that perhaps the Basotho leaders in particular should take for the challenges that Lesotho has faced in recent years. If we look at the issues of the high HIV and AIDS prevalence, you've also got issues of poverty, unemployment, not to mention some of the environmental degradation issues as well. Walk us through what the leadership's responsibility is at such a time as this.
Sure. I think the greatest responsibility now is trying to find a sort of a meeting point in order to implement some of the recommendations that came out of SADC. The challenge before was that there were difficulties of implementing the resolutions come about because of the fluidity amongst the parties. Challenges are that there's a lot of floor crossing, and now people who would be enforcers of some of the recommendations that come from SACU would be enforcing those against former allies, etc., who are now part of an opposition party because as a result of this fluidity amongst parties in the country. So the primary responsibility of Lesotho leaders now is maintaining that stability, but also implementing all of the recommendations coming out of SADC in order to avoid further tensions, in order to also avoid the most extreme result which would come from the instability is, SADC sanctions, as what we've seen what SADC did in 2014, 2015 with Madagascar, for example, where they were closed out in terms of the decision-making of the SADC regional body, but could attend on an observer basis until they resolved the domestic political instability. So that's really primary responsibility that Lesotho leaders have. But obviously Lesotho being a much smaller country that can almost be seen as an appendage, with all respect, of South Africa, is an economy that depends quite heavily on South Africa's economy. So, when there's prosperity in South Africa, that prosperity makes its way to Lesotho. And, given the high unemployment and low growth environment we're in South Africa, that has also had a negative impact on Lesotho to the extent that they're also sitting with high levels of unemployment and, slow growth at a difficult real economic environment, which is what again ignites those political tensions. And so apart from maintaining the stability and implementing SADC recommendations, they need to also find a way to chart the economic recovery that obviously depends on South Africa recovering, which will then have spillovers to most of the SACU member states in the region.
So citing stability and SADC recommendation implementation as one of the key agendas for the incoming leadership. I mean, looking at the former Prime Minister, Mr. Thabane at large, also made the same promises when he took over, promised to listen to SADC as well, bring stability to Lesotho. I mean, now that there is a new Prime Minister making the same promises, I mean, ultimately what has changed, and where does that issue of trust come in as well?
Yes, the instability has been quite difficult in Lesotho, even leading to high-level assassinations, and even now what former Prime Minister Tom Thabane has been embroiled in terms of a murder for hire against his former or his ex-wife. Is a whole part of this whole high-level political instability game that has been played. But I do think that the key contenders, and I think historically the key contentions have been between former Prime Minister Musisidi and former Prime Minister Thabane, who have been at loggerheads with one another and have, in many instances, with former Prime Minister Musisidi using his private relationship with the king in order to dissolve parliaments where Tom Thabane was the Prime Minister at the time, in order to destabilize the government process in Lesotho. So I think now that there is a new player, things could be different in terms of someone who is outside the key contending members. But I think there still needs to be a lot more implementation in order to see whether this is just all talk. And I think the bigger challenge is that former Prime Minister Tom Thabane is still part of the All Basotho Convention and is still in the leadership of the political party, despite not being the Prime Minister, which I think will make it difficult for the law to take its course in terms of the allegations of his involvement in a murder for hire against his ex-wife, which is, I think, what a lot of Basotho are waiting to see in terms of the law taking its course such that they feel and understand clearly that no leaders are above the law. And I think this is a key area that Basotho leadership need to lead by example.
Siya, I just want to end off with a two-folded question. Looking at, early on you cited some of the mutually beneficial projects between the two countries, South Africa and Lesotho. But ultimately, has South Africa done enough to perhaps provide solid advice to Lesotho? And then in the same breath, why should South Africa be worried about the well-being of Lesotho at large?
Sure. I think, as I said earlier, the geographic proximity between the countries just makes it, an imperative that you cooperate. Lesotho being pretty much located in South Africa or along the borders of South Africa, and very close relations with the Free State and Lesotho as a country, are very porous borders. As a result also of the Southern African Customs Union, which is enabling trade and is intended to liberalize trade and border controls amongst the countries. And so really the cooperation is a matter of imperative. I don't think, though, that South Africa has played a critical role. I think the role we've played in the Lesotho conflict is similar to the poor role we played in the Zimbabwean conflict, particularly during the years of former President Thabo Mbeki, who had this notion of silent diplomacy, which never really allowed SADC and the whole neighboring community of countries to actually call Zimbabwean leaders into account, to actually resolve the political tension. I think a similar thing is playing out in the case of Lesotho. Other countries in the region, for example, as I spoke earlier about Madagascar, who was excluded from SADC for a period of about a year and a half, had actually had to face the political tensions, resolve them, and implement democratic elections and fix all of the internal political challenges in order to resume their membership in the SADC community. And I think that was a critical role in enabling sustainable political stability in the country. And I think to date, Madagascar shows quite relatively high level of stability from where we came from in 2014, 2015. And I think so South Africa's role in Lesotho needs to be much more proactive, and I think we really need to find a way to enable Lesotho and Basotho people to see the rule of law take its course, but also to make all of the commitments that will lead to a long-term sustainable political situation in Lesotho, unlike what we've seen where it will last for a couple, 2-3 years. There'll be a dissolution of the parliament, new snap elections, the leadership changes, etc. And this has created a kind of political fatigue also for the Basotho civilians. And so we need to actually enable more sustainable political commitments from the part of the Lesotho leadership.
All right, Siya Biniza, let's leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us. Political economy of Southern Africa. Just unpacking the relations between South Africa and Lesotho. Obviously, the Mountain Kingdom has, been under quite a lot of political instability for quite some years now.